Hello and welcome to episode 5 of the Info Diet podcast with your host, me, Michael Gimmerin. Today we're joined by Drew Schoenecker. Drew wants to talk about all kinds of interesting things, and I personally like Drew because he is the best medical researcher I've come across. That said, Drew, why don't you talk for a minute about yourself and set the stage for what you want to talk about today, and then we can get into the information environment and tips and tricks that you use and others can use to be better.
All right, Michael. Well, thank you for having me on today. I, as much as I, live and breathe all things healthcare and medical, with a background working, in clinical laboratories and hospitals, working in emergency room medicine as a phlebotomist, to the business side of healthcare, and now in technology and healthcare consulting for early stage startups. Today, being a friend of yours and knowing kind of your wheelhouse of conversations, and I'd like to, if we could, maybe go the direction more of current events, because I think right now a lot of the things that have been happening this week that have perked my interest kind of dovetail into some of the things that you've been talking about on Twitter. And starting, of course, this week with, you talk a lot about, how it's getting harder and harder to censor conversations and how they're just not going to be able to do it. And I found it fascinating this week, that Instagram and Facebook, I think it was just Instagram and Facebook, decided to take down not just a video, but all Andrew Tate as a whole. And
also TikTok and YouTube, but you can't take him down because his marketing scheme is to have everybody cut up his video.
Yeah. So
good.
So I felt like, in terms of a conversation, like taking a look at, what is it that he actually did? What is he guilty of? And how that dovetails. Because I think in the video itself, the clip that I saw started with him talking about the people who are in charge of the world, end quote. And I think for a lot of people, I'm a researcher, right? So early on in COVID, having worked in healthcare through Ebola, having just studied a lot of different topics in healthcare, immediately you could tell that something was up. And, it became apparent fairly quickly that, this was not just about a virus. This was about power and control. And I think that, and those that kind of recognized what they were saying wasn't necessarily gelling with what they were doing, or even if it was, that the end result was that a consolidation of power and control. I find it interesting that of all the things that prompted Tate to go down was the week that, he made statements about power and control. So I sat back and I was
okay, wait. So Tate didn't just make that video about power and control this week, and that's why he went down. The reason why he went down is because his message was accelerating, and the number of people that he was in direct contact with. So Hustlers University was 1,000, 5,000, 10,000, 100,000 people all of a sudden were coming in and they were hitting his message. And Tate is an extremely dangerous figure to the status quo because he is the perfect embodiment of the underclass hero, right? So our society, generally speaking, is broken into different classes. And when I say classes, I don't necessarily mean socioeconomic, although there is a degree of overlap between the socioeconomic level of a person and the likelihood that they're in a class. It's a particular value system that they hold. And so you have the underclass, you have the working class, you have the managerial or academic class, and then you have the inheritor class. And the common story for an underclass person is that they live on the streets, they're exposed to violence. A lot of them want to get out, and the way that they get out is typically as an entertainer or as a sports star. And the way that underclass people tend to make money is purely extractive, right? So they tend to be involved in drugs, which is inclusive of entertainment. That's why you get sports stars. Weapons, so war, right? And then basically like the ultimate commodity, which is girls. Okay. And so, and you can take a legal or illegal side on either on any of those. And so I'm not suggesting that anything that Tate did was illegal, but he was certainly involved in one or more of those things. And this was how he originally got power. And then what you do is you take the excess profits from those to get involved in how the managerial class or the inheritor class make money, which is through financial instruments, right? And so in a sense, Hustlers University was an arbitrage, an information arbitrage of all of the skills that were emerging on the internet that allowed someone to make money, sold through the underclass. And the thing about Tate is that he is the perfect embodiment of that, right? He's a 4-time world champion. He's got fucked up teeth. He has the he has the authenticity. And so he speaks directly to that class of people. But the thing is that if you're speaking truth from the underclass position, so you're like basically a slave that's escaped, because the underclass typically is slaves. So the archetype in history for Tate would be like Spartacus. If you're speaking about that, the reaction of men who are deltas and gammas in the working class and the managerial class is going to be extreme, because what you are showing by showing people behind the curtain is that the entire way that they build and construct their identity doesn't help them, right? Whereas alphas at every single class will look at Tate and sort of laugh and be like, yeah, it's true, right? They'll like laugh about it. Yeah. But the people who do the everyday work, right, who generate the most value for society, and that's typically working class deltas. So this would be like all the guys that are like, they want to be left alone. They work in service jobs. They're like garbage people. They're like plumbers. They're like guys on the manufacturing line. They're farmers. They're the people that we need to survive. When you have somebody in the underclass that shows up all of a sudden and breaks free, and typically you have that because the inheritor class has not done what they're supposed to do, right? So they move from being nobles, which have a sense of duty to the other classes, to aristocrats, who are mostly extractive, right? So we've moved in the civilizational cycle to where the inheritor class people are mostly extractive. And so because of that, there is an opportunity for heroes, underclass heroes, to emerge, to sort of reset, turn over the apple cart and reset the system. And Tate is an example of that. The problem is that Tate emerged in this era where there is a much bigger story that's taking place. And that's the story of the second estate being overthrown by the third estate. And what do I mean by this? So that the first estate generally is the church or the king. The second estate are the nobles, and then the third estate are the commoners. And so if you look at our society for the last, let's say, 400 years, it's been run by the nobles. This would be people who are the heads of businesses or people that are the heads of institutions. It has not been run by a king, right? The entire idea that our leadership, which would be the executive and the executive branch, is elected among a representative body, is this idea that the nobles get together and elect sort of who is going to be the figurehead for the society. But in actuality, it's the permanent power of the nobles, what we're calling like the deep state, that controls things. And the nobles affected this transfer of power starting in 1430 and really ending with the Treaty of Westphalia by developing a new technology, right? Or sorry, riding the wave of a new technology, which is the printing press. And that allowed the number of people who were literate to go up, and the emergence of a fourth estate, which is the media. And so the nobles used their money to invest in the fourth estate to communicate to the entire society, thereby shifting power from the first estate to the second estate. And over the 300 years that took, everybody went from the church and the king are in charge to some form of the nobles are running the show. And yes, there were dictatorships, but the balance of power was significantly changed as a result of that. And there's a thesis that's happening that the internet is affecting a similar change where the third estate is now overthrowing the second estate. So that is because anyone on the internet can be a publisher. You can be a publisher. I can be a publisher. We don't need to go to NBC, ABC, CBS, or 3 or 4 newspapers to get our story out, or spend millions of dollars printing up flyers and mailing them to everyone in the world. We can just start touting on a YouTube. Because we can do that, we've effectively created a fifth estate, which is everyone is a journalist, everyone is an investigator. And that is in turn causing a huge amount of information to occur. And as a consequence of that, in every single category, we're getting curators that are emerging from the common people who are, what we call influencers today, right? But they're really just people that are taking the best information and trying to get it to the people that are happening. And because their authenticity is tied into basically their authority and responsibility is linked. So like if, for example, the second estate was to pay off an influencer, that would become very obvious to the influencer's audience because that person's message would diverge from the sort of the authority and responsibility being linked. And so you can see this as like selling out is like a concept that happens. And so there's and because anybody can be an influencer, then in the ecology, a new influencer will immediately appear. And so the second estate's power to take over specific curators is totally neutered, right? You kill one head and then 5 more will emerge. Mm-hmm. And so we see these commoners from the third estate, people like you and me, right, who are not sitting on vast generational fortunes that we're using to manipulate society through our control of the media. And all you have to do is spend a few minutes reading about who owns whichever media companies to understand that it is controlled by a few families. Then you can see like right away, okay, now this situation has shifted. And Tate, who is fucking hilarious, has completely upended that apple cart. And what's happened is they're using the exact same tool, which is censorship, which really, if you think about it, is the violence of excommunication. So like if you were to speak out against the church 500 years ago, you would be excommunicated and therefore not have access to heaven, and nobody would want you in their society. And that was very similar thing that the second estate had also adopted, right? So, for example, you're in the medical field. If as a doctor you speak out against the medical zeitgeist, they pull your doctor's license, the American Medical Association or whoever it is, and now you can't practice medicine. And so it completely and totally delegitimizes you in the eyes of the society, and all that money that you've invested in debt to get your medical credentials and your education, everything, it becomes worthless. And so as a consequence, people are afraid of the violence of excommunication. And so they're more likely than not to just go along with whatever the institutions say, even if it means violating their Hippocratic oath, right? And so you are seeing that exact thing play out right now because it's the only move they have. But the problem with the internet is that you can't censor people because it's free to distribute information. And so the very act of cutting somebody off is basically saying like, hey, we're the powers that be. We don't want you to look at this person. Everyone's like, wait, why don't you want me to look at this person? And so Tate is just, and Tate's a chess player, right? So he probably saw this coming. So we're going to see now what he's going to do. And he already has hundreds of thousands of people who are getting his products. Right. So he already has a direct relationship with them through Hustlers University. And what people don't understand is if you think about your network, right, all the people that you interact with, there's like the one guy that's the political guy. So when every few years or whatever that politics happens, you need to like figure out who to vote for and what the issues are. You still decide yourself, but you go and you ask that guy. So if Tate has 100,000 people that are all making money, right? So his whatever it is that he's doing is working. Then those people are going to start having success in their local networks and their communities, right. And they're going to become somebody that people turn to for advice on making money. And so when they ask those people, but how are you doing this? Oh, I'm going with Cobra Tate, right? I'm going with Andrew Tate. Then people are like, who's that? Oh, he was banned from the internet. Oh, I don't know. He's kind of misogynistic. And then they sort of look into it and it makes him more powerful. Anyway, that was a huge, long diatribe, but That's just my interpretation of the situation.
Well, and I knew that I was going to be able to get you to go and kind of outline how all this works, just so it's not necessarily Tate making a video or putting out a clip or an opinion on control. But I do find it interesting that of all the things at the time when that started going viral, at least in my view, but it's the network that he represents and the network that he built and the people and the image and just what everything he is.
Well, he basically is preaching, wake up, you're in a dream, right? And the institution, the people who are running things, and again, it's not like there's 50 guys that get in a room and they're like, okay, this is the plan for the next 10 years. It's an emergent phenomena, right? Yeah. So these people have power. They want to meet other people of power. Then they do business deals together. So it's like, and you can also take the opposite side, right? So like, you think that all the people who run the world don't collude on things. I mean, it's kind of like an absurd statement to make. So of course they collude on stuff, but it's not so overt. And it is subject to all of the internecine fights that we would always see throughout all of history, right? So one guy's wife moves to another. Look at Gavin Newsom and I think Donald Trump, right? So the wife moved from one to the other. There's all kinds of this and that happens. Somebody, gets his son killed, and so then he has a permanent vendetta, and then this family is upset with that family for 100 years, and so then they get all their, serfs to fight each other out. So you see all of this stuff happen, and then like the top class, right? These people, they typically want to, get the lower classes, the underclass and the working class to be distracted by things that keep them in line, right? So, whatever it is that they want to distract them with, divide and conquer. And then what Tate was doing is be like, no. Rich people didn't have a mask. They didn't have to do the paperwork. You're a sucker, right? And so and they took him out.
And so I think, though, when you talk about the institutions versus a network, and you look at the institutions that I like, this is where my questions to you come up is as I sit back and, everyone kind of a lot of people are starting to wake up and see what Tate's pointing out. Right. And that's where he's kind of growing and piggybacking off of everyone waking up, and people are drawn to it. And I think the people who are really, that we look at and we're just kind of like, what are we going to do with these people in society? The ones that are just flipping out, they're, kind of under a mind control. They are locked into a very toxic, news media, bad info diet, if you will. And really, they've become the weaponized population.
They were always the weaponized population.
Yeah.
So there's no they've becoming. It's exactly the way it's always been. Nothing has changed. The only thing that's changed is that you can now actually see more of the totality of what's happened. It's like
the Minority Report, if you will.
No, so like, yes, but like just to simplify it, imagine 300 years ago, you came up with some, statement about physics, let's say Newtonian physics. And so it describes the universe as you experience it. And then as people are testing out your theories, they come up with examples that that are not captured by your model. And so then you have to invent a new model that captures more of the stuff, right? So you have like quantum mechanics or relativity now is more advanced than Newtonian physics. And it's not that quantum mechanics and relativity didn't exist. It's just that we couldn't see it, right? And so from a social ecology perspective, there have always throughout all of history been people like Jeffrey Epstein. Always, always, always. They've always existed. They probably will always exist. It's just that most people didn't understand because they didn't see. But now they see and they can't unsee. And then once you see it in one pattern, then you start seeing it everywhere else, right? And so we're at that era where you're like, oh my God, you have the Lusitania, you have the Gulf of Tonkin, you have weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, you have on and on and on and on. And so you're like, wait, what is actually real? What is history? This is all, and then people
fake history
go crazy.
Yeah. And that, so I guess when we look at, what I've been thinking a lot about lately is the institutions of power that govern our everyday lives, that people aren't necessarily aware of, and that really the control that they have over their lives, right? So through COVID, we saw it with the CDC, the FDA, the NIH, and the power and the influence that they wielded over people to literally change their behavior, how they treated family members, how they interacted within society, and I think, we can talk about that angle, but when you go to things like, I think about food right now, with food prices going up, and that Amish farmer, that they literally are just going after, who's trying to create, I think they're like $300,000 in fines for him just growing organic food, and and then you look at the Department of Education, and the influence that they have over education. All of these networks, and I've heard you talk about in the past how they're starting to fizzle and break apart. I guess my question to you is, all of these US institutions that our parents' generation and our grandparents' generation truly built and in many senses bow down to, and let them dictate how their lives are going to govern. Where does the rubber meet the road? What does that look like?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. Number one is the FDA and the USDA and the NIH and all these entities, they do something. Okay, we created them for a reason. And the reason is it's much easier to have a central point organizing collective action than it is to have a bunch of independents making decentralized decisions. The trade-off is that when you have a central point doing collective action, is that the number of things that you can do is by definition smaller, and your ability to tolerate variance in what is happening is less. And so, but because you get so much efficiencies and economies of scale from everyone doing it together, it's okay. And insofar as the institution is able to resist corruption from within, and it's able to have some kind of accountability to the people that are using it, right, through the political system, then like people are going to be very supportive. And what we've seen happen is that through using the internet and through using newer technologies, these institutions have been able to ratchet down and create more power for themselves through the expression of what they are doing. And they are getting away from the fundamentals that they are supposed to be responsible for. And the people, because of the degradation in our political system, don't feel that they're accountable, right? Like, how do you, Andrew Schoenecker, how can you hold the FDA accountable? There really is no way, right? Or you say like, my father or my mother or my grandparents, they were given these drugs that was the standard of care during COVID, and it ended up killing them, even though they told us that blah, blah, blah. Who do you hold accountable and why for this, right? You don't have an exit for that energy. And if you don't exit that energy, then it just builds up until one of two things will happen. You'll become apathetic, right? And then that will cause issues for you and for society, or you will basically become more extreme. And when you have this happening to millions and millions and millions of people, then the probability of something extreme happen just keeps going up, right? And so like the other day, I think I said somewhere, with Anthony Fauci, right? There's a lot of evidence, there's a lot of information out there to suggest that he and Deborah Birx and the people who are responsible for fighting the COVID pandemic may have been, how shall we say, less than competent, and may not have been with the interests of the people at heart, right? And so like when you tell a boomer this, they kind of go like, let's not rock the boat. Yeah. Right. When you tell a Gen Xer like Joe Rogan this, they say things like, well, we see that there's smoke, but we should trust the process. We should allow these people, the investigation and the systems to go and look into it and blah, 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 before we conclude that there's fire. And it's between those two groups, Gen X and the boomers, that power currently resides. And so that's the response you see in society. With millennials, right? Because each time it's going to get more extreme until the underlying issue is dealt with. The comment that you hear from millennials is, we need to try him, we need to convict him, we need to hang him.
I hear that a lot.
Right. So that's the sentiment. And millennials are not in power, right? So you have the apathetic people, but they don't count because they're not excited to move action. And then you have the millennials, which like, look, from my perspective, there's more than enough evidence to get this guy convicted. I understand that we need to go through a process because we can't have vigilante justice because all of society will break down. Okay. But like, there's more than enough evidence to convince me that this guy has committed crimes against humanity. And I am looking for some kind of resolution of that internal dissonant conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And and when the millennials come to power, and it's not necessarily Anthony Fauci, it's the next version of him, because the people who are in charge, they're always doing the same stuff, right? It's not new to have a guy who's manipulating his position of power to enrich himself, right? It's like, human corruption exists. It's why these people go to the top, right? It's like they want to have that power.
They're okay with they're okay with doing whatever they have to do to get it.
Yes, the problem is that people believe in justice and they believe in fairness. And when they don't feel like there has been justice or fairness, then it ratchets up. But it doesn't ratchet up like really, really quickly. It ratchets up over generations. And so where the millennials would say, this guy's guilty, but go through the process and then execute him, Gen Z, the guys that'll come to power in Gen Z, will just do political violence. They will not wait for the process because they'll see what their older brothers and sisters and what their parents' positions were.
Yeah.
Right. When Jocko Willink and his generation, who are very, calm, they're elder statesmen, right? When they turn over to be emeritus, and so they're not actually in charge of society anymore, then you will see political violence, the likes of which we haven't seen in America in 60 years.
And so that's when the boomers have cycled out.
The boomers will be cycled out, and the people like Jocko, who are like 45, the people like Joe Rogan, they'll still be alive, but they won't be calling the shots. It's the guy on the ground who's holding the rifle who's important. It's not the advisor, right? So like for men, when they reach a certain age between 60 and 70 in our society, they're supposed to shift over to being a mentor. They're not supposed to still be the guy who's taking action in the street. And so they're supposed to mentor the next generation. And then that next that's why we have comments like, you don't become a man until your father dies, blah, blah, blah. So when that next generation, which would be the kids of the Gen Xers, when they get into power, they will have seen how the boomers were out to lunch. The Gen Xers were like, trust the plan. And the millennials will say something like, hey, this needs to happen. So a lot of millennials will get canceled by the boomers and the Gen Xers because they'll say extreme things, but they won't do extreme things. And then the Gen Zers will see that the millennials will cancel for saying extreme things. And so they'll just do extreme things. And that's when the system resets. So we're going to have this gradual buildup of people saying more and more extreme things until you start to see emergent, like, solving of these problems at the Gen Z level. So we still probably have 10 to 20 years before really, really serious stuff happens, because it takes generations for these things to cycle through. I know that's not where I wanted to go with this conversation, but
well, I just find it interesting because I look at healthcare and I look at, we're very.
And by the way, I'm not an advocate of violence. I would really like us to offboard, right? So like we're at the Gen X thing. Great. Let's get them in a trial. Let's see the process.
Yeah.
Let's get some measure of justice for people whose grandparents were murdered or whatever, right? Like it needs to happen, right? It needs to happen. There needs to be a reckoning at a society. Like I'm an extreme millennial. We need to have a reckoning at a societal level for what just happened. It must happen. If it doesn't
happen,
it's going to get much worse.
Yes.
And I'm saying this because I have a degree in classics. Like, look at history. We are not like beyond history. It will repeat. There must be justice for what happened, for the lockdowns, for everything. It must happen. If it doesn't happen, it will accelerate. And this is unfortunately what I think will happen, because nobody is going to have the stomach to provide justice for the system. And so the system will just filter down to the basis level. And it's terrible.
And I think that's where, so I try to take an optimistic approach that we're going to somehow get there, because as you pointed out, the alternative is apathy. And apathy truly is, especially in the information environment that we're living in, it can control your behavior. It can control your mind. and that's in effect, a net benefit to these institutions of power. So I'm going to take an optimistic approach that we eventually get there, but working in healthcare, and I think I'm looking at how do we retransform healthcare and how do we do it? And I think just about everyone that I know in healthcare is apathetic and 100% given up on trying to fix the system for within the system.
Yeah. So that is the general theme in Silicon Valley as well. So Balaji Srinivasan has his book, The Network State. And the basic thesis of this at the most macro level is that people have given up on reform and they've chosen exit, right? So there's two choices when you're confronted with an institution that has sort of lost the mandate, right? And is getting away from its core jobs to be done, is you can reform the institution from within. And this is what the boomers and the Gen X people will talk about, or you can exit the system entirely. And so you have a generational split where people who are in the younger generations believe and want, and technologists who are focused on the future, they're like exit. So what happens? Do we reform the FDA? No. What happens is that there will be a restructuring of that jobs to be done. The more the FDA drifts from its core jobs to be done, the more energy will go towards the jobs to be done, right? Which is basically evaluate whether or not a drug is safe. There was tons of research that was done in Africa on all the COVID drugs. You knew very quickly by looking at that research which drugs showed promise and which ones didn't. The next version of the FDA will include all of those Africans that have smartphones and Asians and everyone else. It will not be a US centric thing. So you'll have a situation where and the government will lose its ability to enforce violence, right? So what that means at a practical level is that you'll be able to get drugs in the mail. And so you'll get a bottle of drugs and it'll be like FDA approved, the Japanese, whatever. So it's basically like the Japan, the EU, and the FDA are like the three institutional regulating bodies for drugs. And then there'll be like a series of decentralized entities that'll be like, this drug has been tested by the whatever, and you can click on it and you'll see thousands of people that's volunteered from all over the world and have very detailed notes and all of the data, and it will show you on that drug, right? And what will be interesting about that from my perspective is like how much overlap there is with the FDA versus how much of it will just be in contradiction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think we may see that across like agriculture as well. You look at the USDA processing facilities, and especially during COVID, it really backed up everything. And I know, being here in Tennessee now, having moved out of Silicon Valley, when it comes to buying beef, I can either, we have state laws that allow us to operate as a network outside the framework of the USDA. You can sell meat within somebody to, in Tennessee, from a rancher to somebody in Tennessee, they can just sell it to without having to go through a USDA stamp, versus if they want to sell outside the stamp. So do you think we'll see a trend so all signs point towards more of a decentralization, right?
Yeah. So all signs point towards the system is becoming less organized. So, right. So we're going to move from an orange industrial organization to a red mafia organization. So you see that everywhere. Right. And the best example is the Polish MiGs. Okay. So in a 24-hour period, you had the White House, the State Department, the Department of Defense, the Polish, and the Pentagon all giving conflicting advice about what was going on with the MiGs to Ukraine from Poland. And the reason for that is that it's just a free-for-all in the government. It's not a unified government. You think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was a unified government response. Even if there were a bunch of factions, they all sort of filtered through, Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother. But now all of these entities know that they can set policy by going direct to the people through the internet first. And so then they all have differing things. And so it's just a huge battle royale that's happening inside of all of these large organizations. And human mafias don't grow above Dunbar's number. So they're only 150 people. So if you have an organization with tens of thousands of people, you're going to have multiple mafias, and they're going to have to make alliances with each other, and their incentives are going to have to be aligned. And what basically this means is that the efficiency of the overall organization goes down. And then the extremeness of the positions that it takes goes up.
Okay. All right. So where do you want to take the conversation from here?
Well, so I want to understand what you use. I don't even know if I can publish this now. We might have to do this again. I want to understand, when you're evaluating medical information, how you are able to sift through the garbage. There's a lot of there. I mean, obviously you don't read, like, you know, the newspapers that are 75% funded by the pharma companies. But beyond that, what is it that, how are you, like, reading papers themselves? What's the process that you go through to make sense of? Because like I said, if I have a question about a medicine or whatever, you're able to figure out the answer fairly quickly with an extremely high degree of accuracy.
I think for me, it comes back to just following the money and following where the source of that information is coming from. So try to think of an example here. I mean, just take like evaluating drugs, you know, it's kind of like remdesivir, how it came. You said, you know, just pull up the old research, you know. I think, see, this is what I'm talking about. We may have to we're going to probably have to do this again, or.
Well, okay, let me ask you. So let's back it out. So basically what you're saying is that you're able to identify, by looking at the institutions that are releasing the studies, right, and asking who benefits, basically what the funding is for that particular drug. And so you're like, all right, this is a bias. This study inherently has a bias. And then you're able to use your background in science to ask, okay, what's really going on here in the actual study? Or,
I mean, you know, to be honest, it just comes from years of research and then just seeing how things plan out. It's no different than curating your own information environment. You know, it's you find your sources that have been reliable on certain information points, and then, you know, you rely on those. So there are
reliable and consistent, right? Because aren't you afraid that some of your sources are going to get compromised? Or do you choose sources that are so, like, weird that the possibility of them being compromised is low?
Yes and no. So some sources that you're definitely always looking to see and asking yourself, when someone steps out of bounds and it's kind of like, okay, this person has, you know, this isn't what I would normally expect from them. What's going on? Right. So then maybe I'll look to a different source to see what their opinion is. And then I have to make a call. Right. And maybe it's just nuanced. Right. So maybe the advice, or maybe the, you know, whatever, it's, what do I see with my eyes? Does it pass the smell test? You know, I mean, I think it just comes from
like,
years.
what's the smell test, right? Like, what's the smell test for you?
So I guess,
like, most people are not reading science papers all the time like you are.
Okay. I guess, you know, for me, it's when, you know, like they released the vaccines, right? The COVID vaccine. And immediately, among, you know, having my wife works in healthcare, you know, in an ICU, she was one of maybe 3 women who decided not to get, you know, the COVID vaccine. Immediately, within 2 days of her entire unit of getting, you know, vaccinated, their menstrual cycles went crazy. They just started bleeding off cycle. They had pounding, crushing headaches. And, you know, and I took that, I was like, you know, brought that back to my network, my, you know, COVID sense making network, and said, guys, I'm seeing this. Is anybody else seeing this? Somebody else's wife who worked in health, somebody else's who worked in healthcare, their wife, same thing. So
yeah. And so then
we had months before we actually knew.
Well,
right?
So then we had directionality, so that a few months later, when the internal Japanese Pfizer docs were released and showed that all of the spike protein concentrates in the ovaries,
correct,
we were like, okay, this is data that supports the anecdotes that we'd already seen.
Correct.
So it's basically like we're sampling all the anecdotes and then saying, okay, well, this is a possibility. And so let's see if there's any data that comes to support this. And in the meantime, let's take the precautionary principle of staying away. It's kind of like how I didn't want my kids to be near other kids whose parents or otherwise had gotten the vaccine, because I thought that the vaccine was going to, I thought that people were going to be aspirating the spike proteins, and that could eventually affect my children. And everyone's like, no, that's not a thing that happens. And then lo and behold, you know, a year later, there's tons of studies now that show that people aspirate all the spike proteins, and that you should stay, if you're not interested in having the spike protein in your body, which is the thing in my view that causes all the long-term damage, then you want to stay away from those people. And that was, again, precautionary principle. Okay.
Yeah. So, and and that extends to other, to all other kind of evaluating drugs, evaluating medical research. There's right now a paradigm that in healthcare that's very much the same as other institutions. In healthcare, it's largely controlled by the pharmaceutical industry. You see doctors that are just disgusted by it. You even have nurses waking up, like statin drugs do nothing but poison patients.
Well, you tell me that, and then my dad, I tell him that, and he goes to the VA, and they prescribe him the statins, and they say, if you don't take them, then we're not going to continue treating you.
Correct. So, but within healthcare right now, though, there are younger doctors that understand that these statins do nothing, and it's kind of so it's
that same generational fight that we're seeing everywhere, where it's basically like the boomers are like, man, let's not rock the boat. Gen X is like, we see smoke, but let's investigate whether or not there's fire.
Exactly.
And they use the sort of CIA, tools to like disrupt the investigation. And then, especially like if you looked at all the COVID testing, it was bizarre that they would be like, okay, this is the problem. And then they would say like, they would look at something adjacent to it and then conclude that that thing wasn't a problem, and then, transfer it over. It's amazing. It's amazing.
Yeah. And we've been seeing now in healthcare is, physician frustration is through the roof. This goes back to just having to use EHRs, right? And just the control that was being, lobbied over them. And it's now you're starting to see it where maybe this, in the past, they'll be like, okay, I'll just ignore this one thing. I'll just, this drug, I just won't use it. I won't say anything. Well, now you're seeing
VAERS
exit the market.
People 100 times more people know about VAERS than they did 30 years ago or whenever.
Oh yeah. As a father of a vaccine injured child, I was, blowing the siren on, hey, maybe we should look at how we're making these vaccines. What I found interesting was in December of 2019, well, I guess somewhere we now know the Wuhan strand was circulating, but we didn't come to know about this for another month. There was a conference held in Switzerland. It was the WHO Blueprint 2.0. It was a vaccine safety conference.
Is this the one where like the guys got up and talked about how the immune system model that we have is 70 years old and it's not very good?
Well, they did not admit that. That was I believe
that was another conference.
I believe.
I was like, I couldn't believe it.
The alarm on that.
I was like, come on, guys, you're using a 70-year-old model. We have all this computing and shit, and like you're like, oh yeah, it holds to the model from 70 years ago. And you're like,
yeah. So, but what they did admit is, you're watching this conference and they're a guy stands up. They're having different forums. They're saying, the guy who teaches, he's like, I teach people how to make vaccines. I'm the professor that does this. The first thing that I tell people, my students is,
are you going to get my entire channel banned, by the way?
You wanted to go, this is why I was trying to steer us into something else. You wanted to go into medical research.
Let's just say that the WHO's advice in 2019 conflicts with the WHO's advice in 2022.
Correct. So this
and like in such a perverse way that makes you sort of question the entire reality.
Well, I find it interesting because this professor stood up and he goes, the first thing I tell my students when it comes to making a vaccine is if you can do it without aluminum as your adjuvant, you should do that. So immediately as a parent, I'm sitting back and going, okay, why? And you start researching, right? And you start finding, looking into, okay, who's an expert in aluminum? Let me go to the Journal of Toxicology, right? And there's a professor from the University of Kiel named Christopher Exley, right? And he's done all this body of work on Alzheimer's patients. And he's, opened their brains post-mortem and they all have aluminum in them. It's like, okay, this is kind of interesting. Somewhere along the line, a bunch of parents of autistic children say, hey, we think that, our child.
Yeah, and all of the autistic kids that went from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 100 or whatever it is.
They're projecting it's going to be like 1 in 2 within.
When they all die and we see their brains have all these heavy metals in them, then we'll of course know. But in the meantime, we have to sit here and listen to it. By the way, for anyone at home, Andrew and I are not anti-vax. The crux of the vaccine issue is all of the studies have been done on the actual inert viral material, not on what we colloquially call the vaccine, which is inclusive of what Drew said, the adjuvant, which is basically something that irritates your immune system to cause it to respond to the inert viral material. So when they say vaccines don't cause X, they're talking about the inert viral material, which is what gets studied. What they're not talking about is the aluminum or polyethylene glycol or any of that stuff that they use to activate all of those, your immune system against that viral material. So that is fundamentally the crux of the issue. It's the stuff that's added next to the vaccine that is what people are claiming is the problem. And there's no studies on it. In addition to, they don't study stacking, right? So when you think about putting multiple of these vaccines at the same time,
the bioaccumulative response, correct?
What was that?
The bioaccumulative response of.
Well, but also like MMR is a good example, right? So it's measles, mumps, and rubella. So each individually, they have a shot for that. They just combined all 3 shots together. And then when they study the effects, they don't study the effect of the whole shot. They study the individual components. Anyway, that's the crux of the problem. And don't believe us, do your own research, blah, 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 right? We're not anti-vax, but you should actually look at what it's a classic switch track where you have one group is talking about a subset and the other group is talking about the entire, the TCO of what's going on. And also like, doing 70 shots for a kid who's under 2 versus a study that only talks about 1 shot. Right?
Yeah. And I mean,
to the point in podcast banned before it even starts.
Well, you got to get all this out. It's just like Joe Rogan, he started off talking about, lizard people and doing all,
I think thankfully no one's ever going to watch this, so it'll be okay.
Yeah. But, back to the point of, the aluminum and things like that, like you said, I'm not anti-vaccine. I would love an instrument a tool that we can have that can prevent disease. Yeah, that's great. But if it's causing a bigger problem than the actual disease itself, that's a problem, right? So, and the bigger problem with, to add on top of, what you just outlined is the fact that there is no inherent placebo that we're testing these against,
That's a whole other problem. That's a whole other problem in science, the reproducibility of it. Yeah. And I think it's really sad when parents come to me and they say like, well, where are the studies that show all of these things? And you're like, well, actually they were all approved under biologic as opposed to pharmaceutical rules. And so there is no double-blind study that shows that this vaccine actually works, right? And that I think is really hard for people because their doctor told them that it works. And then I say like, okay, go ask your doctor for the study, and the doctor can't come up with it. They're like, well, I learned this at Harvard Medical School, right?
And to be clear, maybe these work for some people, they just didn't happen to work for my child. And I think that's where our focus needs to be, is how do we make these safe and effective for everyone? And, if we wouldn't have a database like theirs if they were safe and effective for everyone. So yeah, that's, vaccines that's a wormhole that we can.
Right. But getting back, basically, when you're in the medical field and something novel happens, you first look for the anecdotes and you see to the extent that they align with the data. And then if they don't align with the data, you think about the simplest model that explains the anecdotes. Is that sort of what you would say you go towards?
Yeah. And I mean, I'm not a doctor, but that's more or less how doctors think. They look at a patient, they look for the symptoms, they go into their head, they say, okay, this is what I've been trained, that when I see X, Y, and Z, this means likely it's this. And then you go and you try to confirm that. And then you confirm it until you can't, until you get more things that say, I think it's about it's being able to be flexible and knowing that things can change over time, right? I think that's the first prerequisite to being able to actually like be accurate about certain assessments, is saying, hey, I might be wrong here, but this is kind of what it's looking like. And
so you're saying in medicine, just like in science, that fallibilism, which is this idea that over time we try to be less wrong, is sort of the core idea. So what you're saying is that the science isn't settled.
Yeah, I mean that's where we get into the debate of science versus, you know,
the science.
The science in quotes versus actual science. And, you know, the problem that we have now is the science has taken over the brains and the collective consciousness of those in healthcare to the point where, you know, we now know what COVID is, who's vulnerable to it, you know, but I took my dad to a doctor's appointment yesterday, and the doctor has 2 masks on, a face shield, and like a surgical hat, you know, in a visit. And you're just kind of like, okay, we're going to keep this theater up. And it's like, you know, these guys, they come out of medical school, they have a lot of debt on their hands, so they're not really in the position, you know, to cognitively. I think you've said it best. What's the old saying?
It's Upton Sinclair. It's hard to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it.
Exactly. So when you're leaving,
that's why I really like all of the Africans who are in the middle of nowhere with no money. Like, you should listen to them. You know, and you're like, this drug works or doesn't, because, like, believe me, they don't have money for like a stethoscope. So if they say that something works, I guarantee you it works.
Exactly. And, you know, and I think that there's something to be said about that. You know, I think that there's the amount of, I mean, look at Fauci, he's retiring, but, you know, kind of what it looks like hinting towards going to the private sector again, to the highest bidder, you know, and it's just a constant revolving door between the pharmaceutical industry and the CDC and the NIH and the FDA, and these guys just kind of, they go back. You know, Scott Gottlieb, he was what was he at, Pfizer? Or no, he's at the FDA, the head of the FDA, and then he goes to be on the board of Pfizer. And, you know, meanwhile, so now he's, you know, got shares in Pfizer, and, you know, and now there's this vaccine coming out, and everyone is just kind of, you know, that's what I think through COVID, not to go on a tangent, that's the thing that blew my mind, is if you would have surveyed people 5 years ago about what is the least trusted industry in the world. I mean, I think big oil might be one of them, but I think most surveys said pharmaceuticals were the least trusted, you know.
Yeah, and then they became 75% of the advertising revenue of every media company on earth.
Yeah.
Including Facebook and Google.
So it's so clear that the conflicts of interest that exists, it's so, you know, it's all right there for you to look at, but it's, you know, the fear and everything that they were able to incite out of people, you know, they were able to steer and control a lot of behavior. So I guess for you, you know, being in healthcare, what I'd like to kind of better understand is, you know, everyone always asks, because they're, you know, I'm even surrounded by family members who, you know, recently, you know, polio, there was, I think, one case of polio that was in New York, if I'm getting this right. And I think it was derived from a vaccine, you know, someone received the vaccine, this person shed, which is, you know, very common with this particular type, the oral polio vaccine, sheds. That's why you see outbreaks.
Why we don't use it?
Yeah, that's why, and at this WHO Blueprint 2.0 safety conference, they freely admitted that there's more vaccine-derived cases.
All of the polio cases in the world today are derived from vaccines.
Yeah,
there are no like, and there is no like natural polio whatever.
Yeah, and the strains that are out there that are the injection vaccines that we get, they are known, you know, to not be very effective. That's not those who are truly in the science they may push back because of the pressure that when you hear a vaccine's not effective, it's like a knee-jerk response. But even I've seen threads on Twitter from people saying, yeah, no, there is no herd immunity when it comes to polio vaccines. You know, it's the concept is bunk. And so when my parents, you know, both reach out to me and they're like, are the kids vaccinated for polio? You know, it's like, there's one case of polio. It's just kind of like, I sit back and I'm like, where are we seriously
we have to wait for them to die.
Stick through this for 20 to 30 years until this generation exits before we fix things.
That's right. That's why immortality is the worst thing that could possibly happen to humanity.
Yeah, that's true.
Right? It's like they're not going to change their mind. People don't change their mind. You know this. They don't change their mind. If they have a set belief system, it's going to be the belief system until they die, right? The best that you can do as a parent, by the way, is instill your kids with the belief system that they should update their beliefs, right? It's like, like, right? You should figure out a way to incept this idea that they're inherently wrong about everything that they believe, and they should be open to course corrections on everything. And then it will sort of, and maybe that's what the internet does, is that we all get so many of these insane institutional overreaches that we just, okay, we don't actually know anything. Let's just take it one day at a time. Let's focus on ourselves and the most things we most care about. By the way, this is my entire life's work, right? Just we don't know anything. Let's just focus on ourselves and what we care about, and everything will work out, because if humanity was going to destroy itself, it would have happened 1,000 generations ago.
Yeah. No, that's, well, can we leave the people with some optimism?
That was optimistic. I just said if we were going to destroy ourselves in some kind of cataclysmic event, it would have happened already. It's not going to happen.
I guess that is technically optimistic. Yeah.
It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. There will be challenges, right? And all the things that we've always seen will always be with us. So there'll always be war. There'll always be pestilence. There'll always be famine. There'll always be psychopaths. That will always exist. But there will also always be beauty and love and new people and all of that stuff too. The system is quite beautiful, right? Like it works well. And the goal of this podcast and the goal of the work that I'm doing is just to sort of help people contextualize what's happening so that they can mentally escape from it. But like most people will not, right? Like the people who follow whatever the science is or whatever they read in the newspaper or on television and don't question it, those people are not going to change.
Yeah.
And it's okay, right? Or they'll wake up one morning because something, the joke, it's not a joke, but the statement is, most people will be in line for the gas chamber before they realize all of the policies that went in and put them in line, right? Like, or in line of the gulag. I think this comes from Stalin's era, right? Is they won't question what's going on until they're literally in line to go into the gulag. It's not a joke. And that's very similar here, is that you weren't medically red pilled until your daughter was vaccine injured. Right? Like there has to be an event that it's spontaneous, right? So nobody can say like, hey, Drew, this is a lie. That doesn't work. There has to be a spontaneous event. And what's so amazing about the internet is that the incidence of these spontaneous events are increasing because there's so much information available. And so like the threshold of having a spontaneous event is going down, right? And so you can see then, of course, the counter reaction from the institutions is to double down, right? Because that's all they know. And so then that just causes more spontaneous events, right? And like this is part of what it means to be human, right? And our history is filled with this. So anyway, the positive message is that all this has happened before and all this will happen again.
So true.
All right, I want to get you back on the podcast after I've done this first round of 10 initial episodes, and then I want to talk about specifically how you evaluate medical information. Thanks, Drew, for joining, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks.